climate science and policy student at BARD, the Center for Environmental Policy there on the side. Got a poo bag from my dog in my pocket. And put that over there. I was like, what is that? Where's my...
Recycling,
yeah. And I'm also an illusionist. No. So this is all from research that I've taken, but I did give a version of this talk a few months ago, and later asked the audience, I'm like, oh, so who's in the room? And they were like, all scientists. It's like, why didn't somebody stop me? Like, you guys should have been doing this. There's a lot of information in this talk. It's a small group, so feel free to stop and interject, ask questions. If anyone's noticed a mistake or something that I've made, feel free to be like, I thought it was actually that, but it's all pretty accurate. So I'm going to talk today a bit about this book. Are you all familiar with Drawdown? Okay, so we don't need to go too much into that. But in particular, I'm going to talk about 5 or 6 of the specific interventions that we can make that pertain to food and agriculture. And really, for me, it's a really great place to focus because it's one of the areas where I think we can actually do a lot in our own lives. And it's something very tangible. Really, the decisions that we make can have a really meaningful impact. So I really like focusing on the food-related initiatives in Drawdown. So we're going to look at food waste, plant-rich diet, tropical forests, and composting. But first, I wanted to talk a little bit about greenhouse gases from agriculture. So what are the sources? And I should mention that for those of you who don't know, typically CO2 equivalent is what we use to measure greenhouse gases. But obviously, carbon dioxide is not the only greenhouse gas. So we're also talking a lot about methane and nitrous oxide when it comes to agriculture. But mostly, typically, things are written as CO2 equivalent. So what would that be if we were measuring this in carbon dioxide? So when we talk about that. So it's really important to note that agriculture is the largest contributor of non-CO2 greenhouse gases, in particular nitrous oxide, which is about 300 times more potent than carbon dioxide as a greenhouse gas, and methane, which is about 30 times more potent than carbon dioxide. So this is really important when it comes to greenhouse gas emissions. Really anywhere from 19 to actually 50% of greenhouse gas emissions can be attributed to agriculture. So they say 29% here. In Drawdown, they say it's more like 50%. When you look at land use changes that are actually being made to mostly support grazing or the growing of feed for cattle and other animals. So what are the greenhouse gases from agriculture? So basically, the carbon dioxide comes from fertilizer production, right? That's a very energy-intensive process. So we're burning a lot of energy and fuel to actually make fertilizer. So that's one of the big CO2 ones. There is burning of fields that can be done. That's just pretty simple. You burn things and CO2 goes up. Then there's the fuel and all of the vehicles that we use. Tractors, all of the farm equipment, right? That's pretty obvious. There are some fertilizers that actually release CO2. The bigger issue, of course, is nitrogen, nitrous oxide, but there is some CO2 released from urea fertilizers. And then, of course, land use change. So if we're cutting down forests, there's the energy that goes into doing that, but also we're losing that carbon sink. So we're releasing the CO2, because a lot of times, especially in the Amazon, we're clear cutting and then burning. So we're releasing the CO2 there, but then actually we're also losing the drawdown from those trees that used to be there. So that's a really important one. Methane is another really big one, and that's mostly coming from enteric fermentation. That's basically cows burping. So they, chew up the grass or whatever they're eating, and then they burp out methane, which hypothetically wouldn't be a big problem unless you have, say, 5,000 cows in a contained animal feeding operation. Then that methane, those emissions are pretty serious. Manure management can also be a big source of methane release, especially when we've created anaerobic conditions. So, manure, if you're at, say, Hawthorne Valley or something, it's a really great thing actually for building soil health and creating even more soil organic matter. But if you've got all of the poo being concentrated into a lagoon, right, and they're spraying down these huge things, so they're making these wet conditions, you're getting a lot of methane that's being released there because we're essentially creating manure lagoons. So it's a big problem. Rice cultivation is another place where we're actually also producing methane, especially because the fields are being flooded and you're creating those anaerobic conditions again. Probably the most dangerous one is nitrous oxide. We talked a little bit about that, right? We put in tons of nitrogen fertilizer, especially in those anaerobic conditions too. You actually get a lot of nitrous oxide off-gassing, not to mention nitrification of waterways and a lot of the other problems that may not be climate change problems, but are definitely major problems when it comes to biodiversity. Let's see if I missed anything there. Manure on pastures also releases some nitrous oxide, but not as much as from fertilizers. And burning fields also releases nitrous oxide. So these are the main agricultural sources of greenhouse gases. So a quick look at how that breaks down. So it's about 10 gigatons of CO2 equivalent a year coming from agriculture. And we're actually seeing a real increase in that, especially from nitrous oxide emissions from the increased use of fertilizers. So as the bad practices that we've cultivated here and in Europe are spreading across the world, we're seeing actually more emissions being created from increased fertilizer use. So that's a really important place to start. And let's see. There is a projection that from 2012 to 2030, nitrous oxide emissions from agricultural soils are projected to increase by about 4%. So that's continuing to go up too. So now looking quickly at the US, there's about 650 million tons of CO2 equivalent coming from agriculture currently in the United States. So that's all of those different sources together. It's not increasing as much as it is in other places, but it still is climbing steadily. So, it's not going in the right direction, to say the least. So something that's important to look at here too is that greenhouse gas emissions vary a lot by which foods you choose to eat or consume. And you'll actually see that most of the greenhouse gases are really in the production phase. So that's the nitrogen fertilizer, that's the farm equipment, very little in transport. Also worth noting here, of course, that the ruminants especially are the big sources of CO2 emissions because you have, of course, the enteric fermentation that's happening from their burps, but also all of the inputs that go into growing the feed for these animals. So it takes a lot to grow a cow to get it to a place where you can eat it. As you go further down, you see like chicken, for example, has a much lower carbon footprint than, say, a cow or a pig. All right. Yeah.
How is it that synthetic fertilizers contribute to greenhouse gases?
Because basically you're pouring tons of nitrogen onto a field. It's very inefficient, generally speaking. So you put, especially also because there's a cost to applying all that nitrogen fertilizer, not just the cost of the fertilizer itself, but to rent the machines to bring it in. So what typically happens in these really big farming operations is they put down way more than they need, and because they want to just have that machine one time. And there are some time-released nitrogen fertilizers that will actually leak out over time. But plants need the nitrogen at different times in their growth phases. So they usually just put way too much in there. And then that actually off gases into nitrogen based as it breaks down. So the nitrous oxide is actually being emitted from that fertilizer that's just sitting in there. And also, again, you through the process of denitrification, so there's nitrification and denitrification. Denitrification is the one that's more common in anaerobic situations, so wet things. So if you've got those kinds of situations, if you're watering a lot and you have too much moisture, whatever it is, and lots of nitrogen, you're likely to have more nitrous oxide emissions.
Okay, thanks.
Sure. Or so I'm told. Want to talk a little bit about the first drawdown solution here. I'm not going to go in specific order as to their efficacy in terms of sequestering carbon or reducing the amount of carbon being emitted, but more to kind of follow the flow of this presentation. So one of the most important things that we can do from a climatic point of view is to eat a plant-rich diet, which makes a lot of sense. So there are a lot of planetary benefits to eating a plant-rich diet. And I say this with no judgment towards anyone's dietary choices. This is just the data. So if we adopted as a nation a vegan diet, we'd see, I'm sorry, I meant to say this. I think I said this earlier. So livestock's about 15 to up to 50% of all greenhouse gas emitted. A 70% reduction in emissions if we adopted a vegan diet. So right off the bat, I don't know if anyone knows, I'm forgetting his name right now, the professor at Bard has done a lot of work around this, and Guy Danichel. And he said if the United States switched from beef to black beans, we'd be actually 80% of the way to the Paris Accord just with that one action. So pretty interesting. 63% reduction in emissions to adopt a vegetarian diet over a meat-rich diet, and that includes dairy and eggs. We'd have a 6 to 10% reduction in global mortality. And $1 trillion in annual healthcare, that's globally, annual healthcare savings from switching to a plant-rich diet. So a lot of benefits to that. And let's talk about those. So there's a study that I found that came out about a year or two ago that's actually aggregating many studies around the health benefits of a plant-rich diet. And this is what they found. You're less likely to gain weight. Reduced LDL cholesterol, lower risk of coronary heart disease, reduced risk of diabetes, increased life expectancy. So there are both health and planetary benefits to eating wisely. And one thing that it's interesting, we'll see when we get into the section around regenerative agriculture, there is a real role that especially cattle play in building soil health and building regenerative systems. So I don't think all cows are alike in the sense of what their climatic impacts are. So if one eats meat, my kind of thinking is don't eat it so often, eat smaller portions and eat better meat, right? Find sources that are local, find sources that are farming organically or biodynamically, and really think about what's the appropriate scale of a cattle operation, right? What's a way that cows can still be on the land and have a regenerative impact, and not, the kind of impact that they have from a CAFO or something like that. So, I'm actually going through this pretty quickly. This is good. So this is the number 5 intervention on drawdown is tropical forests. So this would contribute to a 61.23 gigaton CO2 equivalent reduction by 2050. They can't quantify what the cost value, the economic value of that would be. But this is basically, land use changes specifically for agriculture is driving the burning of tropical forests or the destruction of tropical forests. 80% of deforestation can be contributed to agriculture. So as I mentioned before, you're also losing this big carbon sink. So this is particularly problematic. And that's primarily for soy feed that's going to livestock and chickens, but also for cattle ranching. So this is a major problem. So it's not just meat. It's important to note, and this was actually pretty shocking when I did some of this research. One of the culprits is, of course, palm oil, which can be found in so many different things. It goes by all of these different names. There's even more of them. So I do have a sheet that I forgot to print out, but I can email it to anyone who's interested, that basically lays out like all of the names that palm oil goes by. and in what foods you can find it. The problem really with palm oil is that it's contributing to deforestation. There are palm plantations that are apparently doing the right thing, but one should be wary of palm oil. It's also actually contributing to the extinction of the orangutan. So most of their lands where they would be have been actually raised, and palm plantations have been planted there. This is the really shocking one, coffee. Oof. So that was a really hard one for me. I drink a lot of coffee. And that's also really because it's such a valuable cash crop. I think it's about $100 billion a year in value, so it's creating a lot of value for communities, but it's also leading to deforestation. So there are things you can do. Cocoa is another one, so chocolate's another problem too. So about 50% to 60% of biodiversity loss across Papua New Guinea and Madagascar are being linked to cocoa production. So where you source your chocolate is important too. And with coffee, you can find Rainforest Alliance certified coffee. So this is actually coffee that's being grown in ways. Shade grown is another thing to look for, right? Because they still keep the shade of the trees. With meat, dairy, and eggs, this is another one. Meat's pretty obvious. We talked about that. The chicken problem is actually the soy. So the soy feed that's being grown to feed animals is a big contributor to deforestation. I don't have, let me see if I have the numbers on that. This is 70% of the cultivated soy goes to feed livestock. So that's a big problem. So I think with eggs and milk and these kinds of things, again, you want to find grass-fed, local, free-range, soy-free, and the unfortunate things, these are all things that tend to increase the price of these products, which would, again, I guess, be an argument to eat it less frequently, but eat the right kinds when you do eat them. But just another way that all of this is also, an economic justice issue as well. Number 11 in Drawdown is what's called regenerative agriculture. So this is 11 out of the 80 solutions that are in the book. 23.15 gigatons of CO2 equivalent reduction by 2050. And this is pretty amazing, $57 billion, which doesn't seem that crazy in and of itself to implement these practices on the scales needed, and approximately $2 trillion in savings if we were to employ these methods of agriculture. So what is regenerative agriculture? There's 5 main attributes to it. No-till. So we know about no-till farming. Basically, you all know what that is, right? Okay. Diverse cover crops. In-farm fertility. So basically, how do we actually create a whole farm system where we're producing the fertility we need? We're growing the legumes and other things that are nitrogen rich and bringing them back into the soil. No pesticides or synthetic fertilizers. Multiple crop rotations. Benefits: increased carbon sequestration. Boost soil health, plant health, and nutrient content. Some of the most interesting work that I'm seeing right now is around soil health and gut health and the connection between the two. So one of the many negative side effects, if you want to call it that, of climate change is actually increased carbon in the atmosphere is actually decreasing the nutrient quality of most vegetables. So while CO2 is food to the plants, the plants that will be growing will be much less rich in nutrients. So it's really important because a lot of the studies have shown that the healthier the soil, this isn't surprising, the more nutrients in the plant, the healthier the biotic matter in your gut is. So these things are all very much connected.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
I'm wondering if you could just describe each of those top bullets, because I'm not sure everybody knows exactly what those are.
Yeah.
And we have a lot of farms around here. We could be encouraging our farmers to adopt some of these practices.
Yep.
A lot of them are not.
I am about to show you a video about regenerative agriculture.
Great.
That will say exactly what these things are.
Beautiful.
So I'll just let that because Gabe Brown will do a better job of it than I will. Right, so we had less nitrogen inputs in fertilizer, which reduces the nitrous oxide emissions. I'm going to get to that video after this one. Sure. Conservation agriculture, so basically you can think about this as regenerative agriculture light. So basically, so much land is under traditional farming practices that if we were to switch to what they're calling conservation agriculture, even though it's not going as far as regenerative agriculture would, that shift alone would have a major impact. So 17.35 gigatons of CO2 reduced, $35 billion to implement, or 37, and about $2 trillion again in benefit. And so what do they mean by conservation agriculture? Minimize soil disturbance, so not no-till, but lower till. Direct sowing of seeds. Maintain soil cover, so cover crops just in and of themselves make a huge difference. They also contribute a lot to the preservation of topsoil, which is another major problem that we're facing, probably with also increased climate change ramifications, especially because you're losing that sink in that topsoil. Manage crop rotation. So typical crop rotation in the United States would be corn, soy, soy, something like that. So, even doing a corn, soy rotation is better than just doing corn. But if we had more crop rotations, there's a benefit to that too. Some increased carbon sequestration, but not a huge amount. And this is what I was saying before. This is not a huge sequestration thing, but in the aggregate, if we switch from conventional farming to more conservation agriculture, the impact would be pretty big. More resilient to weather extremes, which isn't necessarily about greenhouse gas emissions, but of course we're going to be seeing more and more weather extremes everywhere. And increased yields. So there's a 15-minute video. I think it's worth watching. Are you guys up for that? All right, this will go into everything we need to know about regenerative agriculture practices. Not on the level of, say permaculture or something like that, but this is about, regenerative industrial agriculture. So Gabe Brown, really interesting guy. You can read a lot about him. Very traditional farmer. I shouldn't even say traditional, modern traditional, in that he was doing very big scale agriculture, thousands of acres, corn, soy, and had a kind of epiphany and has become a real champion for these regenerative agriculture practices. And what's really interesting about him is that he's really, working with the farmers in America's heartland to switch. It's also worth noting that the Department of Agriculture is actually adopting these ideas from him. And so they're advocating for these same practices. So, it's interesting anyways. You never think of the government, our government, being progressive in any way. But there are people out there trying to do good things, and the Department of Agriculture also sees the benefit of this. So let's watch his talk, and then we'll continue.
How fitting it is that this event, which is titled Roots to Wings, is taking place here in North Dakota. For the motto of the state of North Dakota is strength through the soil. And that's what I'm going to visit with you about today. It's about our soil resource. Agriculture has been challenged. How do we feed 9 billion people by the year 2050? With today's current production model, we can do that. It is a model with which one tills the soil. It's a model of monoculture production practices. No matter where you go around this great state, there's fields of wheat, fields of corn, fields of soybeans, and many other crops. It's one of livestock which are now in confinement, whether it be poultry housed in poultry houses or beef cattle in a feedlot, for example. However, these practices have come at a cost. They have caused the loss of biodiversity. Healthy native rangeland has hundreds of different species of plants and animals and insects. Monocultures have but very few. This lack of biodiversity has led to the destruction of our soil resource, and that's what I'm going to visit with you about today. I'll share some proof with you, and this is statistics provided by North Dakota State University. In Walsh County, North Dakota, back in 1960, the topsoil was 34 inches deep. In 2014, that topsoil was only 15 inches deep. A stunning 56% loss. The organic matter level on that same soil had gone from over 8% to less than 3% today. Look at the ramifications of that. The soil on your left was a soil that had not been tilled and had not seen monoculture production practices. That's the same soil 17 years later on the right. After 17 years of the production model of tillage and monocultures. It also destroys the pore spaces in the soil. Those pore spaces are critical for the life in the soil, are critical for water infiltration. Because if we don't have soil aggregates, we cannot infiltrate water. I took this photo in a field less than 10 miles from where you're seated today. That shows a half of an inch of rainfall can no longer be infiltrated into the soil profile. If we can't infiltrate water, then what happens? We resort to things such as tile drainage. And you're seeing this all over the central United States today. What happens when we put tile drainage in and we do not have the soil aggregates to hold our soils in place? That soil ends up in the watershed. And unfortunately, along with it goes all the nutrients that may have been applied to those fields. That lack of biodiversity also leads to lower nutrient cycling. If we don't have adequate nutrient cycling, we're going to have to add more and more synthetic fertilizers. Those synthetic fertilizers come at a cost. Cost of fossil fuel usage. And they also spur the decline of the soil biology. We need to understand how soil functions. How soil functions is due to that biology. Because the plants get their nutrients via the biology. High synthetic fertilizer use also aids in the propagation of weeds. Most weeds love nitrogen. The more synthetic fertilizer we apply, the more weeds we get. If we have increased weed pressure, what do we have to do? Spray herbicides. Now, unfortunately, many of those herbicides are chelates. What is a chelate? A chelate binds metals. So any of the metals such as magnesium, manganese, iron, zinc, copper, then become unavailable to the plant. If the plant cannot uptake these micronutrients, it's more prone to disease. Because plants cannot ward off diseases on their own, we need to spray fungicides. Fungicides, then, are detrimental to what? Soil biology. Because plants are not healthy enough to ward off pests, we then need to do what? We spray pesticides on the crops, which are meant for human consumption. Because we spray pesticides, we have a decline in what? The very predator insects, which would take care of the pest, which we are spraying. We also have a decline in pollinators. You can hardly pick up a paper or a magazine today without reading about the plight of our pollinators. These pollinators are critical in our crop production. The current production model is all about killing, whether it be weeds, a fungus, a pest, our diversity, or our profit. Take a look at these projections just put out by North Dakota State University. There are 2016 projections for some of the major crops in our state. Every one of them projects a negative return. What impact does that have on the quality of life of those producing that crop? But take it a step further. What impact does it have on our schools? Drive around this state of ours and you're going to see a lot of small towns that have fewer and fewer children attending the schools. What effect does that have on our businesses and then on our communities? What effect does the current production model have on our health? Take a look at this. The nutrient densities of the foods that we produce have declined anywhere from 50 to 65% in the last 50 years. This has had many negative consequences. The United States spends more on healthcare than any other developed country in the world. Yet look at this. We lead the world in the incidences of ADD, ADHD, cancer, osteoporosis, Alzheimer's, autoimmune diseases, and the list goes on and on. This is not acceptable. It cannot continue. But the good news is there's another way, and I'm going to share that with you. It's nature's way. Look at how nature functions. In nature, there's no mechanical tillage. Yet in our production model, we're tilling the soil. In nature, there's always armor on the soil surface, protecting that soil from wind erosion, water erosion, evaporation. Yet in our production model, the fields lie bare. Nature cycles water very efficiently. It's able to infiltrate into the soil profile, then due to the large amount of organic matter, it's held there for such a time it's needed by plants. By destroying our soil resource, we can no longer infiltrate the water and store it for when it's needed. Nature has living plant root networks. There's things growing all times throughout the growing season. Not that way with production agriculture. So often we hear about the production model that we have today as the conventional model. I would argue that nature's way is the conventional model because it's been around for eons of time. Think of it this way. What did this land look like 400 years ago? You had a lot of diversity. There was diversity of plant species, forbs, grasses, legumes, trees, and then also you had a diversity of animals and insects. And all these work together to build a healthy ecosystem. So, there's 5 principles that we must follow in order to follow nature's model. They are, number 1, least amount of mechanical disturbance possible. On my own ranch, we have been 100% zero-till since 1994. We have not tilled the soil at all. The second tenet of soil health is armor on the soil surface. We always have the soil covered. That's a picture of one of our fields following seeding. If that field is no longer prone to wind erosion or water erosion because we're keeping armor on the surface. Third tenet of soil health is diversity. My son teaches rangeland management at the local community college. He brought his students out to one of our paddocks. They counted over 140 different species of grasses, forbs, and legumes. Why don't we have that in production agriculture today? On our operation, we're trying to mimic it. These are just some of the cash crops that we grow on our operation. We don't just grow one cash crop, we grow many. Along with that, we do not grow cash crops as monocultures. In the upper left there, that's oats with 3 types of clover grown in it. In the upper right is a very diverse cool season broadleaf mix. The lower left, that's corn with hairy vetch grown in it. The lower right, that's sunflowers with over 19 species of covers grown with it. Tremendous amount of diversity feeding soil biology. We also have orchards on our operation. These orchards, besides providing us with the fruit, we're able to have livestock grazing underneath them, thus stacking enterprises. We have 5 acres of vegetable production, but it's not as monoculture. In between each of those corn rows is rows of peas, beans, squash, zucchini, carrots, pumpkins, and a variety of other species, so that we get the benefit of diversity. Fourth tenet of soil health is living root in the ground as long as possible. You don't have to drive very far around this state to see that there are monocultures growing for only a short period of time, and then the land lays idle. These are just some of the cover crop species which we planted on our operation this past year. We actually planted over 70 different species. From the time the snow melts in the spring until the snow stays in early winter, we have a variety of species growing on our land to feed soil health. We're optimizing solar energy collection, because how the system works is we take sunlight through photosynthesis, it makes carbon, that carbon is transferred down to the roots where it's leaked out as root exudates. That's what all the biology feeds on. We need that biology in order to get the nutrients to the plant to nourish animals and people. For you see, if we have healthy soil, we're going to have clean air, clean water, healthy plants, healthy animals, and healthy people. We have to focus on feeding biology. Along with this, then, we're able to feed all of the wildlife that's on our operation. We also feed a myriad of different insects. Insects tend to get a bad rap. We like a wide variety of insects, including all the predator insects, which take care of the pests. We want to address our problems through biological means, not through chemical means. Dr. Jonathan Lundgren, one of the world's foremost entomologists, told me this: for every insect species that's a pest, there's 1,700 that are beneficial. Why in production agriculture do we aim at just killing that pest, when we should aim at providing habitat for all those beneficials? The reason producers have a pest problem is because of the lack of diversity. We need to think biologically. Fifth tenet of a healthy ecosystem is animal impact. On our operation, we run a herd of 350 beef cows. We also grass finish that beef because we know it's healthier, both for us and for the animals. We have a flock of sheep and raise grass finished lamb. We have pastured pork. We have broilers, which are out on pasture. And we have a flock of 750 laying hens, which are also out on pasture. We also have bees. Those bees, besides pollinating our crops, provide us with honey. Here's what we've done on our operation. When we started in 1993 on the left, we had very shallow topsoil, 1.7% organic matter. We could only infiltrate a half of an inch of rainfall per hour. We then went no-till. We started to diversify the cash crop rotation. We noticed an improvement in soil health. From there, we started to add cover crops, another improvement in soil health. Our organic matter levels rose, our infiltration improved. We then started integrating all of these livestock species on top of it, another marked increase in the health of our soil ecosystem. Now in 2013, we actually have a plot of land which is now over 11% organic matter. The same soils that in 1993 could only infiltrate a half of an inch of rainfall per hour can now infiltrate over 15 inches of rainfall per hour. We've done this without the use of any synthetic fertilizers, pesticides, or fungicides. We've done it by following the principles of nature. This has led to a ranch that is profitable every year, regardless of price. And we do this without taking part in any government subsidies of any kind, whether it be a crop insurance, EQIP, CSP, or any other form of government payment. Thus, we are not a burden to society. The stacking of enterprises has allowed us to produce many more nutrient-dense calories of food at a lower cost as compared to the current production model. Yes, we can feed the world, and we can do it in a way that regenerates our resources, thus healing farms, families, and communities. Thank you.
He's awesome, right? Yeah.
Really good.
You can find lots of stuff from him online. He's a really great guy. Great. Okay, so that's regenerative agriculture. We talked about the 5 tenets of soil ecosystem health: no mechanical disturbance, armor on the soil surface, diversity, leave a root in the ground, and animal impact. If you're also interested, Alan Savory, I don't know if anyone's familiar with his work, somewhat controversial, but he talks about regeneration of the land through doing massive short-term herding, rotation of livestock. So they'll bring 400 animals to a place and leave them there for 12 hours and then move them. And the soil compaction coupled with the manure and other things actually builds these healthy ecosystems. So trying to mirror how buffalo used to move across the land, grassland regeneration. Really interesting stuff. Wanted to talk briefly about organic agriculture. This isn't listed in Drawdown, but the United Nations has done a fair amount of work on this and have come to the conclusion that emissions in conventional production systems are always higher than those of in organic or biodynamic systems. And so just wanted to share some of the climate-related benefits of organic agriculture versus conventional agriculture. Lower nitrous oxide emissions, we talked about nitrogen inputs, big thing we want to avoid. Less CO2 because we have better soil structure, right? We're also sequestering more carbon when we have more soil organic matter too. So really, the more biodiversity we have in the soil, the more carbon that we can pull down into it. Lower CO2 emissions from farming systems, less energy than production, increased microbial diversity in soil, more efficient carbon uptake. Oh, that's what I just said. More biomass in plants, so we're actually getting more bang for our buck too. So a single plant will actually feed more than one that's farmed conventionally, and building soil structure and soil fertility. Increase water retention capacity. This is really important as we think about the storm events that are becoming the new norm. I've seen some other stuff from Gabe Brown where he has videos where they're doing these perk tests of water in his land versus a neighbor's land, and just it's amazing what he's done. So I think he showed that slide, something like half an inch of rain and how it had flooded a field. Versus, I think he said he can take 15 inches of rain now in his soil, so it's pretty astounding. So I think there's a real, this is also very important given extreme weather events. It's not just about greenhouse gas emissions. Reduced erosion, reduced financial risk of farm operations, local economic benefit. So now this is going to be the kind of most comprehensive part of this talk about food waste. Food waste is the number 3 intervention in Drawdown that we can actually do. I mentioned it's the most comprehensive because I also want to talk a little bit about the food waste project that we're developing in Rhinebeck right now and invite you all to get involved with it. But wanted to just dig in, and I also wanted to say that there are copies of a book called Food Foolish in the back, donated very generously by Bob Fox here. Sent them my way. And you all are welcome to take one of those if you're interested in going deeper into the food waste conversation. Just for what it's worth, 70.53 gigatons of reduced CO2 equivalent if we actually tackle food waste. It's a major, major problem, not to mention the fact that 900 million people are chronically hungry. It's crazy. Just digging into food waste a little bit. First, want to talk about the difference between food loss and food waste. So food loss is basically all of the food that never actually makes it to people. So that could be food that's left to rot in a field, food that spoils during transportation. That's all considered food loss. And then food waste is all the food that gets discarded once it actually gets to consumers. So food loss and food waste are the 2 parts of what we're talking about when we talk about food waste. About 1.4 billion metric tons of the food the world produces is never eaten, which is pretty crazy when you think about all of those inputs that are being put into this food that's never being consumed. There are 800 million, no, I said 900, 800 million people who are chronically hungry. So this is just a pretty crazy thing. Carbon emissions from food waste, about 4.4 gigatons of carbon dioxide equivalent in the atmosphere each year, just from the waste. This is pretty crazy. If food waste were a country, it would be the third largest emitter of greenhouse gases. That's just our food waste. So China, the United States, food waste. The water used to grow just the food we discard is greater than the water used by any single nation. So obviously, we're not talking specifically about water in this, but this is another major issue we need to be talking a lot about. So we're using a lot of fresh water for food that's never actually being consumed. Annual cost of food waste, estimated to be about $411 billion a year. So let's talk about it locally. So what does that actually mean for Rhinebeck? So there's a picture of little Rhiney. And this is town and village, so Rhinecliff is included in this here. Americans waste about 40% of their food, so we're just talking about the waste side, not just the loss here. The wealthier nations tend to have a lot more food waste than food loss because they have more advanced refrigeration, transportation infrastructure, and they're also getting much larger portions of things and throwing, they have much bigger fridges. They're probably less, we're probably less aware of, even all the food. And we have things that are artificially low in cost because we subsidize them, or the government subsidizes them, or the fuels to transport them are subsidized. So we don't necessarily appreciate the true cost of a piece of food. So we have higher rates of food waste in the United States than we do in other places at the post-consumer level, rather than in a lot of the developing nations. There's more at the food loss level. So that's about 100 billion pounds by consumers. 300 pounds of food is tossed away by Americans each year. So for Rhinebeck, this is obviously not an exact science. I just took the number of people at the last census and applied the averages to us. So we're wasting about 1 million kilograms of food per year in Rhinebeck. That is about 6 million kilograms of CO2 emissions, CO2 equivalent emissions, which is the same as taking about 1,200 cars off the road for a year. These are some funny little calculations I made. We could power a house for 500 years. We could power a TV for 4,386 years. And we could power a light bulb for 56,338 years with just the food waste in Rhinebeck. So I'm going to talk a little bit more in specific about the Rhinebeck project in a minute, but wanted to just talk a little bit about this idea of the waste hierarchy. I don't know if you all are familiar with this, right? But there is, especially when it comes to food waste, a hierarchy that we want to follow, right? So at the top is source reduction, i.e. let's not have the waste, right? What can we actually do to reduce it ever becoming food waste in the first place? Then let's take the stuff that is available, make sure it's getting to the people who need it most. I want to highlight here the Feed HV program that started out of the Community Foundation in the Hudson Valley. That's working to get food from farms, restaurants, and other places and get it to food pantries and people who need it the most. And it's an all-volunteer network, so you can they'll send out an alert saying, we need someone to drive this food, or we're looking for people to come and glean on this local farm and get this food to people who need it the most. So there are people who are trying to address that. The next best would be then to feed our animals with those food wastes. And then, the industrial uses, right? Biodiesel, these kinds of things. Then it's composting. So composting, of course, has a benefit too. But again, we want to avoid creating the waste in the first place. But that's the better use. And then the least preferred is going into a landfill, right? Because A number of reasons, but a big one being methane emissions from all of that food waste. So all of our dumps are producing a lot of methane right now, and that methane is being driven by the organic matter that's in our waste. So if we take that out, we have far reduced methane emissions, and as I mentioned, they're 30 times as potent as carbon dioxide. So what are some of the things that we can do to avoid creating the food waste in the first place? Menu planning, right? So actually thinking about what you're going to prepare and buying just what you need to prepare those dishes. A list on the fridge of all of your perishables, just what you have. When we moved into our house here, the fridge was already there, and my wife is German, and her fridge growing up was like this big. And now we have this like massive refrigerator in our house, and we're constantly losing food in the back of it because we don't even see it. So just listing the perishables that you have, making a menu plan that actually uses those perishables will actually do a lot to reduce the food waste. Portion control, this is super interesting. A lot of studies have been done around the size of the plate and the amount of food that we put on. So this is actually also a very effective weight loss strategy. Use a smaller plate and you lose weight. I don't know if anyone's ever been to the Bard cafeteria. They got rid of trays there and moved to smaller plates, and it's significant, right? I mean, it's hard if you're there because you're like, I'm hungry, but I don't want to carry this drink. But I actually, Lori Houston did share some data on that with me. I forgot what it was. Maybe you know. I don't know, but it did significantly reduce food waste, and of course cost too, because people are eating less with the smaller plates and not having the trays. Make stocks, smoothies, soups, right? So when you're cutting up your vegetables, don't just throw them in the trash can. Save them, make stocks out of them. Eat leftovers and pack lunch, right? A lot of food waste is, of course, coming from the restaurant industry. It's a big problem. And it's a lot healthier for you too if you're packing your own lunch. There's a lot more calories and salt and other things in restaurant food typically. So if you can be planning ahead and packing your own lunch, eating leftovers the next day, right, you're also reducing your food waste. This is really important. Use by, sell by, and best by. This is super confusing. So just want to highlight what they mean. So use by is, and I'll read this if you can't see it, label aimed at consumers is a directive of the date by which the product should be eaten, mostly because of quality, not because the item will necessarily make you sick if eaten. So after the use by date, product quality is likely to go down and safety could be lessened, but it's not necessarily like you have to throw it out. Sell by is the one that's aimed towards the retailers. So it forms them by the date by which the product should be sold or removed from shelf life. Doesn't mean that it's unsafe to eat. And best by is really like when this thing's going to be its tastiest. So these are really confusing. There are movements afoot to try to get some standards in reporting on these things. Most of this is not happening in the United States. There are some nascent projects to work on smart labeling of food. I think the UK is doing a lot more around this. And in France too, they're doing a lot more around this. France actually, I don't know if anyone saw the ugly fruit campaign that they undertook. Another big issue, big source of food waste is that we want every apple to be perfectly round and without any blemish. Stores like Whole Foods actually demand that their retailers do this. So there's a ton of food that's basically not fit for market, but totally edible, totally nutritious, and we end up throwing it out. So, there is a benefit also to, processing those foods, like those ugly apples for ciders and things like that. But France did a whole national campaign around ugly fruit. And actually there was a startup in the United States that was marketing ugly fruit as a thing, but obviously no one's really heard about it. So that's another big issue, is that consumers' expectations around how a piece of fruit should look leads to a lot of food waste. Number 60 in Drawdown is food composting. Composting is meaningful and we should be doing it. I did want to stress that avoidance is better. Let's not have the food waste, but if we get to the food waste, then this is the best way to deal with it. 2.2 gigatons of carbon CO2 equivalent by 2050. We actually have about, basically cancels out, you save about $60 billion and you spend about $60 billion. But obviously other benefits too, because you're building something that can rebuild soil health. So a lot of benefits to composting, and they are enrich soil's health. We just said that. Suppress plant diseases and pests, reduces the need for chemical fertilizers, encourages the production of beneficial bacteria, reduce methane emissions from landfills, reduced hauling costs. And then I just wanted to talk about 3 different kinds of composting. So we have backyard composting. This is the classic one that we hopefully are all doing. Right, in the mixture of greens and browns. I think there's a lot of resources online to help you get going composting. There is actually a program in Dutchess County, I don't know if it's still active, where you can buy compost tumblers from the county at a reduced rate. If you don't have them, there's a couple different ones. Of course, you can also just build a pile. When you, of course, remember to mix the greens and the browns, so it's not just food waste, but you're supplementing that with straws and grasses and things like that. Vermiculture and vermicompost is really fun. It's actually really easy to make a worm bin. I've done them many times. You have to, I'd say, I find we produce far too much food waste to do vermiculture in our own house. It stacks up so quickly that we get fruit flies, and then they infest the house, and then my wife makes me put the worms outside, and then they die in the winter. So I put them into the garden. But it is a pretty cool process, and you get a really rich fertilizer that can be used for houseplants and other things in what they're called the worm castings, which is just worm poop. But pretty cool. And if you like to fish, you've got worms right there. So lots of good resources on building a worm bin. You can do one in about 15 minutes with a plastic bin and 2 plastic bins and a drill. And then you make a bedding with newspaper and you're basically good to go. Bokashi, this is pretty interesting. This is a really good technique if you have a small apartment or you don't have a backyard or someplace where you could have a compost pile or bin. This is an anaerobic fermentation process that actually, it's like an anaerobic digester in your house. This is a Japanese method. And it breaks down food pretty quickly. I actually have something that I think I included on here. Yeah, the green cone solar digester. These things are really cool. It's essentially an anaerobic digester that's all powered by the sun. You dig a hole in your yard. You bury this plastic basket in there. And then there's a black cone that goes over that plastic basket. It's about this tall. And then you put this green cone on top in a sunny spot, and you can put anything in there, even pet waste. And it heats up, and all of the critters crawl through it too, and it just breaks everything down. So if you have stuff that isn't compostable, meats, cheeses, these kinds of things, you can actually put them into your digester. And these are like $129 or something. Doesn't require anything other than a hole and some sun. You put a little starter in it in the beginning to get the biotic activity going. And then interestingly enough, ours produced, we got a ton of soldier flies, which are really amazing insects that aren't native to this area but have moved north with changing climate. And these are the larvae of these flies eat everything. They're like amazing digesters of food waste. And then they actually turn into flies, and the flies have no mouths. So they can't cause damage to anything. So basically, when you have the larvae, they'll eat your food in like a day. They'll turn into these flies, and then they just mate and die because they can't eat. But anyways, So there's a lot of people who are actually trying to cultivate soldier flies right now as a way to handle food waste stuff. So if you get soldier flies in your compost pile, you're very lucky. Okay, so I wanted to talk, this is the last thing that I've got to share, and just tell you a little bit about the food waste project that we're doing in Rhinebeck. So I'm a member of the environmental committee for the town and village. It's a joint committee. And there we go. We've organized, when the committee was created about 3 years ago, we decided to use climate change as our organizing frame. And there's 5 of us on this committee, and we each have a different area of focus. Mine was waste. It wasn't actually something that I was particularly like, I want to be the waste guy. But the mayor asked me to do waste, and here I am. I really felt that food waste was a really, if we're thinking about climate change, then food waste is probably the most important thing that we can be doing around waste. Obviously, we need to be thinking about producing far less waste in general, and recycling and all of these things are also important. Upcycling, repairs, all of that. But I think food waste is really interesting because it's a very tangible way to engage a community. Everybody produces food waste. When I was at Etsy.com, the website, for 10 years, and I ran all of our social and ecological impact work. And one of the first ways that we really started to engage the company was around waste. So we actually spread out these tarps in the office and dumped all the trash cans out so people could actually see what was being thrown away. And we actually sorted it and found that, about 50% of what was being thrown away could be composted, recycled, or whatever it may be. And so then we actually went around the office and we took away every single small trash can. And we replaced them with these big bins that had compost, electronics, right? Every kind of sortable option. And every night we weighed and measured all of our trash. And we, just by taking away the small trash cans, we reduced trash to landfill by 30%, just like that. And we had the data to show. So it was like really tangible for people. So I thought that food waste would be a really good way to start in the town and village of Rhinebeck. So a little bit about what we've done. This past summer we commissioned a survey and raised some money to hire some graduate students at Bard. Talked to about 400 people we heard back from, and talked to every single restaurant owner in Rhinebeck to learn about attitudes towards compost. Interestingly enough, a lot of people are composting already, so that we thought that was good. A lot of reluctance from restaurants to actually do composting here because of just the time or the cost involved with it. And not a real appetite for a municipal compost program if it cost money. That was kind of the big takeaway. So there wasn't a real willingness to pay for, say, curbside pickup, but there was a lot of openness to a drop-off either at the town facility by the aerodrome or at the farmer's market, so people could bring their waste there if they weren't already doing it. So we got a lot of great information, and we feel like there's a big opportunity for composting as well as education around food waste reduction. Locally, we've been talking with some people at the school about what we could do there, and I actually think that the institutional partners are going to be a really important piece of this. So how do we get the hospital, the schools, the restaurants actually doing food waste, as well as engaging the broader community and reduction strategies and creating places where they can compost their food. We also created an intermunicipal memo of understanding. So we teamed up with Red Hook and Tivoli and actually tried to join forces to take on food waste together and applied jointly to the DEC for funding for some of this project, which we did not get. But there is a real appetite, so we are thinking not just what can we do in Rhinebeck, but how do we start to think about a little coalition of Northern Dutchess communities. That's the DEC grant I mentioned. So where we are right now, our next steps, we're working to actually get Rhinebeck designated as a climate smart community. That's the town and the village. The reason to do that, there's a number of them. We've actually done a lot of the things that we would need to do to qualify to be a climate smart community, and becoming a climate smart community opens up more pathways to funding. So we're working on that right now. And scoping a role for someone who's working as a climate coordinator for the town and the village, and perhaps for Northern Dutchess, with a mandate to take on food waste as really the first project. So I'm working on both the climate smart community stuff and the scoping of what is this food waste project. I should mention that there are a couple places. There's the village highway facility and the town dump that could be really good candidates for a compost facility. So we are looking into what it would take to actually develop a place where we can actually create the compost. And from there, we're trying to raise funds to actually fund this project, because there's not really any money in local budgets to fund something like this. So I actually feel this is somewhere where a public-private partnership could be really helpful. So when we did the survey, we did it that way. I actually raised the money outside to fund that work. And so I think that there's something to this model, because as you all know, there's not a lot of additional resources outside of the basic services that are being provided here. And then we want to hire someone to actually lead this work. So that's where we are right now in this project. And then the other piece of it with this coordinator is to work on the policy front, because I think that's where we can really shift things. As I've done research into successful municipal composting programs, they're usually accompanying policy shifts. So could we work on the policy front to say require that all institutions in the town compost their food waste? It is important to note that the plastic bag ban that was just passed on the state level actually has provisions in it around mandating food waste collection in New York State. I don't know all the specifics of it yet. There seem to be some loopholes around size and proximity to a composting facility. Apparently, if you're 25 miles away from one, you don't have to compost. So developing a compost facility locally that could serve Red Hook and Rhinebeck and other communities around here, I think would really help with that. So I think the policy piece is key. And from there, yeah.
Can I ask the compost from this facility, is it going to be used?
Yeah, so the idea is to actually, I don't know exactly what form of composting we're going to be do, whether we're building big piles. There's been conversation around anaerobic digesters, but our hope is that we can create a product that can actually be sold back to the community or given to the community based on how it's funded. So I really like the idea of actually creating like Rhinebeck Compost as a business that's revenue generating that we can actually use to support this program. But yeah, the idea is to build usable compost. The village of Rhinebeck is already collecting all of the yard waste, trees, grass, these kinds of things. That's typically not included in the compost because you don't know what people are spraying on their grasses or these kinds of things. But they're already producing mulch that anyone can get at the village highway department. But yeah, the idea is to create something that will be usable to, increase the soil health in our community as well. After the Connor's talk here, I was like, we need to turn every grassy sidewalk into pollinator habitat. It's just so crazy. We don't, so what if we actually use that compost and, maybe gave it away with native wildflower seeds and just told people to go nuts. That would be pretty great. So that's where we are in this project. I'm really hoping to get this moving. We've been thinking about it for a while, and there seems to be a lot of political will, certainly on the village level, to actually implement something meaningful. So I'm really inviting anybody who's interested in getting involved with this to contact me. I do have an email sign-up sheet back there where you can put your email down. You know, we want to engage the community. As I mentioned, the school, not the school administration, but the students are really excited about this. So I think that's another place where we can really be engaging the children, young people, around this issue. And, you know, ideally, think about compost and a school garden and, you know, looking at the whole cycle of it. Because I also think that that's how change will probably happen too. If children are going home and talking to their parents about it, that's how the shift will happen. So that concludes my presentation on food waste. Drawdown kitchen. Here's the book, Drawdown, if you haven't seen it. I think everyone should have a copy of this. At the very least, and I'll mention in October, the Drawdown Learn conference is coming back to Omega. I went last year, and I have to say, one of the things I really love about Drawdown is that it's a framing that's hopeful, because there's so much to despair about right now. But here are solutions. Here are things that we can do. And going to that conference was mostly powerful because of all of the young people there. And there were a lot of high school students who were like, let's do this. And so when we think about Sunrise Movement and all of these things, like that's where the energy is right now. And we really need a lot of energy. So, you know, my motto, and one that I feel like if we all take it to heart, is something Teddy Roosevelt said, which is, do what you can with what you have where you are. So I'm trying to just dig in here and do whatever we can in this community. So I invite you all to join me. Thank you. Great.